What's up, interpreters? My name is Sam Ham. I'm a professor emeritus from the University of Idaho and effectively a lifelong member of NAI and before it AIN. And I'm very happy to be here with you, Paul and Song.
What is up, interpreters? I am Paul Caputo. Very happy to be here with Sam Ham, who just gave maybe the most modest introduction of Sam Ham someone could give. So legendary interpreter figure in the field, Sam Ham. So glad to be here with you. And with me, as always, is...
Hi, I'm Song. I'm your NAI event manager. And what's up, interpreters? Sam, this is the second time we've had you on our podcast, and it is always a pleasure. And it always coincides with baseball season being played. So
Go figure. That's correct. You've never contacted me about anything during any other sports season.
I know.
Well, we may be able to get into the respective playoff races for the Phillies, Mariners, and Red Sox, who are mine, Sam's, and Song's teams, respectively. But in the meantime, let's talk about the incredible contributions that Sam Ham has made to the field of interpretation over the years. Sam, you and I go way, way back in my NAI career. You were one of the very first people I met. And it's funny that we mentioned baseball, because the story that I always tell is that you came up and introduced yourself to me in North Bend, Washington at an NAI Northwest region, Pacific Northwest region workshop, because I was wearing a Phillies hat and you were wearing a Mariners hat, and we were both baseball fans. Little did I know at this brand new job, my brand new career, what a legend you were. But here we are talking to you now about almost 20 years later, about everything we can't possibly cover everything. So we've picked out a few things that we want to talk to you about. So I'm going to just ask you first. I know that the whole notion of hard research on brain science and the way people learn and the way people understand messages has been central to the work that you've done. So that's where I'd like to start. Can you talk about what it is, that informs the work that you do that led to, all of your writing on thematic interpretation?
I can, and I can tell you, it all began in the summer of 1979 when I was the interpretive team coach at Olympic National Park. And I wasn't the chief of interpretation. I was the coach. I didn't evaluate people. I coached them. I worked with them, and I would go around the park, and it's a rather large park, and go to every talk, every guided walk, every presentation and orientation talk, and then come back at least a second time to follow up with the interpreter on the previous advice I'd given them. It was a great job. But I myself were giving that summer my own guided walks, and I did a campfire program when somebody else couldn't be there. I put on my uniform and I went and did the campfire program. But what I noticed in my guided walks is that I was in this amazing rainforest, the Hoh rainforest in Olympic National Park, a temperate rainforest, gets 12 feet of rain a year, and the trees are huge, and the wildlife is fantastic. And to me, it was just one of those magical places where, especially at that young, impressionable age, it would blow me away. I would literally get goosebumps sometimes walking down this trail and looking at these giant, almost several 100-year-old trees that were 6 feet, redwood size, Douglas firs or hemlocks and western red cedars. I was noticing that my audiences weren't getting the same reaction. It was when the thought is as obvious as it seems today to any interpreter or communicator of any kind. It occurred to me very clearly that I'm not the audience. Those people are different than me. And then a little while later, I figured out because they outnumbered me, that made them normal. and so this interest suddenly spawned. I'd always been interested in communication psychology in one way or another, but that recognition, is as obvious as that might sound today to your listeners, led me on what is now a more than 4-decade journey of trying to understand cause and effect relationships between communication input and accomplishment. And in other words, how can an interpreter do his or her job in certain ways that are more likely, that statistically, empirically, are more likely to produce the outcomes that you have in mind? like goosebumps, caring, loving, and things mattering, and then those sorts of things that interpreters appreciating that we talk about all the time. What are the cause and effect relationships? So that's where brain science, and particularly cognitive and behavioral psychology, became the focus of my attention. But the focus of my attention was certainly on doing research. Later, I got my PhD, and then we know, 450 publications later, I took research seriously. But what I really, really worked at that attracted attention to my work in behavioral sciences and cognitive sciences was that I could interpret it. That I could make it not esoteric. I could make it's thoroughly theoretical, and it's all based on some pretty esoteric science if you read it. But I wouldn't bog down my students or interpreters when I train them with that stuff. I would just give them enough of it so that they appreciated the evidence, so that they knew I wasn't making stuff up, and then show them the practical application. And that was the link between applied communication, practical interpretive application, and the empirical basis for it. And that's basically what my career has been defined by, trying to make that science that is clearly relevant to interpreters applicable to them, so they can see how to use it to do their everyday work better.
Sure. So it seems to me like you can take these, the brain science that you're talking about, and there's a direct application to your TOR model, right? Which is thematic, organized, relevant, and entertaining. This was a really significant contribution to the profession of interpretation. How did you come up with this?
Yeah.
I mean, if you Google this, right, it pops up on Wikipedia about thematic interpretation.
I still don't know who did that site, but they did a pretty good, they did a pretty good job.
They did pretty good. They did pretty
Yeah.
good.
That's a great question, Song. But I have to tell you that the TOR model, TORE, evolved. It resulted from all of that research. In 1990, I went to Costa Rica on a sabbatical leave. And I did a half-year sabbatical, and I was attached to the National University of Costa Rica, as that was sort of the institutional affiliation. But I was there to write my first book, which would be published in Spanish a year before it was published in English, because I had a contract with the U.S. State Department in Honduras to produce a certain number of copies of it, so that which helped finance my work on the book and my sabbatical leave. But when I sat down at my little laptop in what my kids call the Star Wars room, because it was open air with bars. But at night, when my computer screen was on, these huge insects would come flying through there. They're all it was quite a show, actually. But it was there one night, and I said, I have got to now summarize and try to put into categories what all this research is telling me. And now, over a century of research on how the brain processes communication and how that communication can influence us in various ways as human beings, how we think, how we feel, how we behave, etc. Looking at all of that research, and those literally hundreds of studies, maybe more, it became pretty obvious that interpretation needed to be, and remember, the first iteration of the TOR model was the EROT framework: enjoyable, relevant, organized, thematic, and interpretation making a difference on purpose. In the first chapter, I tell a little bit about the history of why I reversed it and made it TOR. And not just because people wanted to add an I and a C and make it erotic, which they did. But it had to be enjoyable to process, because these are pleasure seekers, they're visitors in leisure settings, right? It has to matter to people, has to be relevant, has to connect to things they care about. That's the R. And it has to be organized for easy processing. One of the first things that happened to a voluntary audience, what I called a non-captive audience, right, is if they have to work too hard to follow your train of thought, or if it seems esoteric or just long-winded, they just tune out.
Right.
Or physically leave you. And so that's ERO, and that is ORE in the TOR model. But that is what entertainment is. People want to make the E entertaining. It is not. It is enjoyable to process, because to be entertaining, which means literally to hold attention, that's what entertainment literally means. if I say to you, well, thanks for your opinion, song, but would you be willing to entertain a slightly different take on that? You see, I'm asking you to hold it in mind. That's what entertainment literally means. And in Spanish and Old French, entretener, it means to hold within your brain or within your mind. ER and O are entertainment. The entertainment industry is an ERO, or in the Torah model, ORE industry. And so when something is enjoyable to process, matters to you, right, and is easy to process, you're going to pay attention to it until the cows come home, unless one of those elements changes or is no longer present. Does that, if that makes sense? And so that's infotainment, ERO or ORE. But it occurred to me, if you want to make a difference, you've got to hold attention not as an end in itself. You might as well just, get a straw hat and a banjo if all you want to do is entertain, right? But it's entertainment for a purpose. And that's where the T comes into play. And this comes from a lot of research on give them something to think about. And that's what a theme is. It's a platform to have their own thoughts, make their own meanings, right? And arrive at their own conclusions, their own morals of the story, right? That's what an interpreter does on a good day. That's Torah quality interpretation. Does that answer the question?
It does. And it's funny, actually, we did a bad job as podcast hosts here because we just assume everyone knows who Sam Ham is. And as you're talking, I'm reminded of the books that you have written, most recently, of course, Interpretation, Making a Difference on Purpose. And I remember when you were working on this book, Sam, this was another NAI regional workshop. We were in Dickinson, North Dakota. The snow was blowing sideways for an entire week. And you and I were sitting there in this sort of dimly lit pub, having a beer, drinking, I think, moose drool, if I remember.
Yeah, we were in Montana, Paul.
I said North Dakota. You're right. This was Montana.
It was Montana, yes. I remember the moose drill particularly. Yes.
You were not in Dickinson, North Dakota. Right. This was the Montana workshop. But anyway, we were talking about the new book that you were working on, Interpretation, Making a Difference on Purpose, which is the current version of your book. It's the most recent book that you've written. And you said to me something that really stuck with me when you first wrote Environmental Interpretation and you were writing about thematic interpretation. You said, I never realized people would write boring themes.
Yeah.
And it really made me laugh. And I think that's where, this idea of making a difference on purpose, having a reason behind doing what you're doing. It's not just enough that it has a sentence, that it's grammatically a sentence and has a period on it on the end. It's got to be on purpose. And I think that that's been so critical to this conversation. And for the listener at home, this is an audio podcast, but Sam is laughing right now, so thank goodness for that. But what is the difference as your career evolved and as your thinking evolved on thematic interpretation, taking us from here is technically what a theme is to here's a theme where you're actually making a difference on purpose?
I chose the subtitle of the book. And notice it didn't have the word environmental. The title didn't have the word environmental like my first book, and and there was a reason that one did, but this one particularly didn't, because I kept hearing from people in the cultural resources field, well, that's nature interpretation. Yeah, but that doesn't apply to what we do. Of course, the human brain is the human brain. It doesn't matter what topic you're presenting. So part of my reason for just the title interpretation, without reference to nature or culture or any, just interpretation, was that. And then the subtitle, to making a difference on purpose, is again me saying, listen, this is not a magic trick you're trying to pull off. You're not pulling a rabbit out of a hat. You're not, throwing some communication thing at the wall and crossing your fingers and hoping to get lucky, which is what you're doing when you just make it up, right? But you can be more strategic. Not to say that some people aren't intuitively gifted at exactly what I'm talking about. They take my workshops all the time. They come up, they love them. They come up afterwards and they say, Sam, I really didn't learn a lot, but now I can explain it. Now I can explain my own brilliance is what they're saying to me, which to me is a great outcome. But I want interpreters to know they can be more strategic, and there's something that word strategy and being strategic sort of sort of rubs against the creative, freewheeling spirit that really good interpreters bring to their work. And that's always been a tough line for me to toe, that some people think, well, having a theme is locking you in, it's restricting or constraining you. And I always say, well, no, a theme is not, it's not a jail you're putting yourself in, it's a creative launching pad.
Yeah.
Once you have this idea in mind, a strong theme by definition is a sentence, or could be a couple of sentences, that without any further development, without any embellishment, without any further anything, just those words already stimulates thought, already provokes thought, what Tilden called provocation. Without any, and if you start with a strong theme, not a boring, listless theme, and this group in the National Park Service in the Southeast region has just developed a fabulous virtual training program based on Tor with Christiana Admiral in the Atlantic office, where they contrast blockbuster themes with lackluster themes. So you can say, which I really quite like what they did with that. I like a lot of what they did, in fact, all of it. But that's the idea, that if you just have this thing in mind that now guides your selection of information, what to include, what to exclude, what to emphasize, what to de-emphasize or leave out altogether, right? But your goal is still this already thought-provoking idea. You're close to success before you even start. But when you start with a boring idea, that sometimes I know interpreters interpret things that are even boring to them, but the boss says I got to do it. So I'm just saying, it's a matter of strategy. This is a terrific starting point. And that's why I have a whole chapter in interpretation, making a difference on purpose, called Not All Themes Are Equal. It's about how to write thought-provoking themes, strong themes.
There's, the big difference between a theme and a topic.
Oh, yeah.
Sam,
that's where it started in 1992 in my first book. People were still getting the two mixed up.
Yes.
And it gets even, I speak Spanish, and I've worked all over Spain and every Latin American country and the Caribbean as well, where to this day, they want, even our colleague Manuel Gondra in Mexico, Paul, he really prefers the word thesis in Spanish, tesis, rather than tema, because in Spanish, the word tema, which is what theme is in Spanish, tema, literally is taken to mean topic.
Yeah.
And so when you're trying to convince people, you're not just picking a topic now then to talk about, you're selecting an idea, a moral of the story, I like to call it, that you're trying to develop. I mean, that's the difference between, otherwise it's just teach or tell.
So Song is going to ask the next question, but I did want to jump in and say, I know exactly the timing of the conversation that we had, because the book Interpretation Making a Difference on Purpose was published in 2013. This, I can tell you, you and I were talking about this in 2009. Yeah. And the reason I remember that is not because of the specific regional workshop that we were attending, but because I was wearing my 2008 Phillies World Series baseball cap, and you thought that was hilarious and that I was taunting you with it. So you
were having a go at me. He was trash talking me like you.
Oh, I already know his backdoor trash talking. Just passive aggressive.
Yeah.
So, Sam, you've mentioned several times your work in Latin America. You speak fluent Spanish. I've heard a rumor about some work you've done in the Galapagos.
Well, it's not just a rumor. It turns out to be true. I've actually worked in Galapagos probably 20 times since the early 1980s. My last couple of times there, I'd often go down and train guides for the Galapagos National Park and Charles Darwin Research Station. And there they have a very stringently defined process to be certified as a guide, which means you're allowed to be a guide in Galapagos. And I've really enjoyed that training a lot over the years. But the last couple of times, I think the last time I was there was 2009, one of the 2000s, fairly recently. I told these guys, they're all what they call Galapagos. You have to be a Galapagos native, which is a Galapagos, in order to be a guide. That you can't just come in from the mainland and hope to get a job, because then you're taking a Galapagos job. And so it's very, very strictly enforced. But I would tell them don't talk to me about this Galapagos stuff, because I'll tell you, I'm at least half Galapagos, because I have trained so many of them over the past 30 years that I know, and I could name them. I've trained several current guides' parents, and in one case, a grandfather. So yes, I've worked in Galapagos for a long time, and a lot of it has been guide training, but also I've done work there with National Geographic and Lindblad Expeditions, one of the truly enlightened sustainable travel tour companies based in New York and Seattle, on travelers' philanthropy, which is where interpretation can be harnessed not only to stimulate thought, make meaning, promote an appreciative attitude about what is being interpreted, but also, which is often all an interpreter wants, but sometimes a behavior is also of interest. Philanthropy is a behavior. It involves donating money, in this case, money to local conservation, right? Not to a black hole, but to local conservation in Galapagos in this case. That worked again. We did it first in 1998, and then we repeated in 2010 because of some changes in that 12-year period, and a new ship and some other things, a major federal budget deficit, and where donations really declined for a period of time, and so we went back and did a redo. But we in 1998 were asked. Sven Lindblad called me on the phone and said, "I think you can help us," and so I said yes, and my wife of now 52 years, Barbara, and I, who's a graphic designer like Paul, and before he became a big shot, executive director, he was a graphic designer. We went down there, and with the help of another one of my former graduate students, did a little bit of research, interviewed guests on these ships, and developed a thematic communication strategy, a thematic interpretation strategy that replaced everything in the ship and create a little visitor center. We trained up the guides who on the shore excursions, every 12 people have to have a guide with them, no more than 12. And the guide gives his or her own commentary, but we showed them strategic themes they could work into their commentary. This was not fundraising. We never asked them for money until the last Thursday night. When they disembark on Sunday morning for the last time to go home. But on Thursday night, they'd come back to their cabins after dinner, and the sheet would be turned down, and then, the obligatory chocolate would be on the pillow. But only on Thursday nights, there'd be this little homespun photocopied brochure called the Invitation to participate in the long-term protection of Galapagos, which incorporated, as well as all the interpretive materials on ship, as well as what the guides were saying in their shore excursion commentaries, these strategic themes. And I was asked in my final presentation at the Charles Darwin Research Station, asked by Sven Lindblad, who'd flown down for this, how much I thought they would increase donations. And of course, I had never ever thought of a number. I was just doing the work, and I told him later that I haven't been asked a question that hard since my doctoral defense, and he totally stunned me, and I hummed and hawed, and then I did a soft shoe, and finally blurted out 30. Sven, I think we can increase donations by 30%. And he nodded, and everybody else in the room looked at him, and they all nodded, and so 30 became the number. Well, in 6 months, we had increased donations by 277%, quadrupled it. And so that was like this telling moment. And then that work became quite famous around the world in the sustainable tourism industry. And we were being asked to go speak everywhere about it. And then since then, we've also done it in Baja California with Lindblad, in the Arctic as well, in the Svalbard Archipelago, a worldwide ocean campaign, and with Natural Habitat Adventures and World Wildlife Fund, another travel partnership in Churchill, Canada, where the polar bears convene when the ice gels to go out and hunt seals again, and which is one of the epic tourism, nature-based tourism experiences. Go see the polar bears in Churchill, northern Manitoba, Canada. Stunning, along with Northern Lights, by the way, just for added value. But that work has become really, really important, and it spawned a whole. I'm really happy about this. A whole emphasis that is known as travelers philanthropy now, and every year or so there's the Center for Responsible and Sustainable Tourism, CREST, based at Stanford University, holds a conference somewhere in the world still on travelers philanthropy. At least I think they're still doing it annually. So that's been quite just a personal one of those things that you're just really glad you get to do, because the results are so tangible and you can see them in your lifetime, and that's pretty hard to come by when a lot of what educators do is long term, and sometimes you don't live long enough to see it all. But this is one of those really gratifying things I've had the great privilege to be able to do.
Well, the question about Galapagos ended in Manitoba, Canada, on with this story. So interpretation really can take you all over the world.
Yeah.
It is everywhere.
I pinch myself sometimes at the places that I have been able to see and know multiple times, most of them.
Yeah.
And many of those times, my wife, Barbara, who is a graphic designer, has been able to come with me. And sometimes she's hired also to come with me. So it's like, not that I'm bragging about this, but I pinch myself sometimes when I'm in these places thinking, I would have paid a lot of money to be here, yet I'm getting paid to do what other people would do just for fun. And so, boy, I complain about a lot of things, but my career is never one of them.
What you complain about mostly is the Mariners bullpen. I know that.
Yeah,
but
right.
So you're touching on the last question I had. I did want to ask you this as we get out of here. So one last question, if you don't mind, which is, you've mentioned your international work quite a bit, and obviously that's a big part of your contributions to the field over the years, not just in terms of the content and the research, but literal contributions to the field, in that your books have been translated and you have not asked for royalties in exchange. You have literally just donated these titles
That's
to
right.
organizations to raise money for their own efforts as well. So that's been philanthropic on your part. But
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, and I'm not going to ask you to comment on that. I'll just do the commenting on it. That is generous of you to do that, and it's important for the field that your work is out there in that way. The question I have for you, the final question here on this episode, and we'll surely have you on again. How much, NAI is involved in international work, right? We have an international conference and we travel around to different parts of the world, and we've interacted with interpreters all over the world. A former guest on this podcast was our tour guide from Costa Rica, Ronnie, and that was a really fun episode for us. I'm curious to know how much of what you write and what you say about interpretation is universally applicable around the globe for all interpreters, and how much of it is specific to individual places?
Well, that's a great question. My first answer is 100% of it is applicable all over the world. There's a reason my books now, the interpretations now in 13 languages. And by the way, I have this wonderful publishing company based in well, it used to be in Golden, now it's in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. That's down the road from you. Fulcrum Publishing, and they agree with this. This is important to me. This is about handing what I said at the beginning of our interview, is that I want to make this approach to communication or interpretation that I call the TOR model, make it available in a very applied way to people everywhere. And that includes, I've worked in about 60 countries, I think tens of thousands of people, I think 60,000. There's still somebody at the University of Idaho that keeps tabs on this. When I go, I send them numbers and they keep accumulating them. And that's because those ideas are applicable, because the human brain is the human brain. Now, how an interpreter applies them, that of course is going to have cultural nuances to it. Nothing is more cultural than how we communicate. And so that's why I'm working with right now Jin Lee from Korea, Professor Lee. He's working on the Korean translations. He'll have it out by the end of the year, he says. But you wouldn't believe the conversations he and I have, and sometimes we bring in Naoko Yamada, who just the Japanese version's just off the press, and so it's out there now. That Naoko, who was my former graduate student, right, did, and because they're both Asians, and even though they're very different languages, there's some cultural things there that they understand with one another that are totally new to me. These are fascinating exchanges of emails with Dr. Lee and earlier with Naoko about how to in the Japanese language, there is no translation or standard one translation for the word interpretation or making a difference. So
no.
It started with the title. So, but as I said, the human brain is the human brain. And so the principles are going to apply, but how a talented interpreter who understands her or his audience communicates, applying the TORNE, how that application looks can be very different and dependent upon the specific place or culture. I mean, even in the United States, right? How I would approach giving a talk is going to matter whether I'm in Seattle, Fort Collins, the Bronx, Biloxi, Mississippi, Atlanta, Georgia, or Miami, Florida. I mean, for all reasons we can all readily relate to, and so it's that. But my approach would be the same.
Well, Sam, we've kept you longer than we meant to. We really appreciate this amazing conversation, and it's such a pleasure for me to get to sit here now after you and I have known each other for so long, and just to sort of to recap, like, let's look at the highlights of Sam Ham's contributions to the field. I mean, that's been really fun and fascinating for me. And so hard to not just talk baseball the whole time. So it's Sam and I text regularly whenever there's important baseball games going on. We're gonna try to do some baseball travel. Sam and I have seen a couple of games together. So this is it was really hard to not just talk baseball the whole time.
I've only threatened to join you on some baseball.
Song and I are trying
you
to get
are
to
more
London.
than welcome.
And so here, Sam, as you know, is how we end the podcast every single time. We're going to see if we can get it this time. And interpreters, that's what's up. Oh man, I was off on that one. I was off. I'm the problem. I continue to be the problem. So Sam and Song, you guys were great. Sam, thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Thank you.
Have a great summer, Sam.